Hi, thank you so much for joining me for this webinar today. My name's Emily Kyle. I'm an attorney here at Kyle and Kupaszewski Law Firm in Scottsdale, Arizona. I practice in the areas of special needs planning, estate planning, guardianship and conservatorship. I do probates and trust administration, and of course, elder law. So I'm so glad that you're here today. We're going to hear from Lori Nissen from Banner Alzheimer's Institute. So in just a moment, I'll introduce her. So thank you again so much for joining. A couple of preliminary things. You are all muted, and if you have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to add to the conversation, you can type that in the chat box. You should be able to find that on your toolbar, typically at the bottom of your screen. I will check the Q&A as well, but it would be best if you could put those in the chat box. And then I will be watching that, and if it's something to be discussed in the middle of the presentation, I'll do my best to get Lori's attention so that we can talk about it. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end to answer your questions. So Lori and I, of course, both thank you all for being here. We hope that you and your families are safe and that you're healthy and that you're finding social distancing not to be absolutely awful, and so that you can see and care for your loved ones, because that's certainly extremely difficult. I know that with my own mom. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to have Lori here. Not only is she an incredibly close friend of mine, but she's an amazing professional here in the community. She's a licensed clinical social worker and the Family and Community Services Director at Banner Alzheimer's Institute and Banner Sun Health Research Institute. She spent more than 20 years specializing in leadership and clinical positions, serving the needs of patients and families coping with emotional, cognitive, and behavioral problems. Ms. Nissen serves as adjunct faculty member at Arizona State University Edson College of Nursing and Health and Innovation. She served on the Governor's Arizona Alzheimer's Task Force and the Arizona Dementia Caregiver Alliance. And she was awarded the 2018 Practice Change Leader in Aging and Health Fellowship. She's incredibly intelligent and articulate and experienced in this area, and I'm just deeply grateful that she was willing to come and speak to us today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to her. And again, thank you all for joining, and thank you, Lori, for what you're about to explain to us. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Emily. That was such a kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I was trying to think back. I think we've known each other for at least 20 years. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be able to present today and to meet with all of you, albeit virtually, but to share a little bit of information about behavioral changes that are really common in Alzheimer's and related dementias. So what I hope we're going to cover today are really some of the common behavioral changes that you might see in somebody that you're caring for that has Alzheimer's or related dementia. Really think about behaviors as a mode of communication. So really an opportunity to figure out what might be causing a behavior or triggering it. And then, of course, really take the opportunity to learn some strategies to really minimize those behaviors. And then, you know, I'm not a pharmacologist. I'm a behaviorist. So my goal is to really teach you ways that you can adjust your approach or the environment or other things to really reduce some of the behavioral distress that you might see in your person. But I recognize and work in a multidisciplinary team. So I know that there are times when really you need to talk to your medical professional really about these things. And sometimes medication is really the best route. So I think it's always good to take a step back and really think about the idea that dementia really affects somebody's ability to manage their environment, communicate conventionally, and behave kind of in a normal or everyday way. I had the pleasure last night of facilitating an adult child support group. So these are people who are taking care of their parents who have Alzheimer's and related dementias. And they were kind of sharing that because that person is so close to them, they sometimes forget that these changes are related to dementia. And so it was really interesting to hear from them that they often have to remind themselves not to take these behaviors or changes personally, but to take a step back and recognize this very idea. Behavioral changes are part of the disease. So when I first started this industry a long time ago, people were always looking to have me refer folks to them that were pleasantly confused. And I never really knew what that meant, because behavioral changes are really an integral part of the disease, because this is a disease that affects the brain, right? So it affects your emotion, your memory, your behavior. That being said, it really requires us as caregivers to be detectives and really anticipate needs, which is not an easy job in any sense. So I remind you of that just because it's important for us to try to implement care with compassion and empathy. So behavior really has a purpose. Excuse me. It often signals kind of an unmet need. It's often triggered by an impetus. And we're charged with the idea that we have to really figure out what might be causing the behavior, and then really try to change the pattern that leads up to it. And by utilizing a different approach, very often we can work towards a different and more positive outcome. So as I was alluding to earlier, we know that the majority of folks who live with dementia, and we know these are long diseases, right? The average course is 8 to 10 years. Are going to have a period of time, typically in the middle of their disease in the moderate stage, if it's Alzheimer's, or in other disease states, even earlier, to have a behavioral disturbance. And so it really behooves us to try to master and figure out ways to manage the behavior so that the person themselves are less distressed, but also really so that we have a better quality of life and we're less stressed. Often in the early stage of the disease, I see more emotional changes, really, as a person may have awareness of their disease, experiencing some loss, frustration, maybe even depression or anxiety. And then in the middle stages, we're seeing more of those behavioral symptoms, which we'll talk more about. And you've probably heard the pop psych term sundowning, which really refers to the fact that as the day progresses, those behaviors seem to get worse. So as the disease progresses, what's interesting about this disease is that it starts out as a cognitive disease, right? As emotional and mood and language and ability to organize, cognitive changes occur. We often see behavioral changes that follow. And as the person declines cognitively, we're also seeing that they're going to decline functionally. So the brain is not communicating well to the rest of the body. So therefore, someone starts out ambulating just fine, and then they're using a walker, and before you know it, they're in a wheelchair. And so once we get the hang of it, this is the hard part, things change. And so really, I think specific to talking about behavior is that it really requires us, those of us who are very type A, often don't do well with this, right? We have to be flexible. We have to be creative. We have to really shift the way we think about communication conventionally and approach. And what's even more difficult, as these adult children were saying to me last evening, is that I've been talking to my mom or dad the same way for the last 40, 50, 60 years, and I'm really having to totally change the way I communicate with them. So when we talk specifically about behaviors, we know that dementia really impacts our emotions. It impacts our ability to organize, and therefore really simple activities that we did that we were very good at become very complex. Navigation is a challenge of our environment. And so often early in the stages where we maybe aren't so aware of our person's changes, this is where people are starting to have fender benders or take off for the Safeway that they have been shopping at for the last 20 years and ending up in Yuma or worse. So communication becomes much more difficult, and just essentially handling change and stress becomes difficult. And so many of you who are caring for your loved one right now, particularly during these very isolated times with a lot of change and a lot of stress and a lot less help and structure, are probably noticing that your person may look worse in terms of how they're doing with their communication, their behaviors, etc., because these changes are incredibly hard on us, but even more so on a person with dementia. So therefore, really, behaviors are the method of communicating, right? So when you can't communicate and say, hey, please stop doing that, or, oh, my back is really killing me, I need some pain medications, or I need something to soothe me, I'm really uncomfortable in this position. Instead, I'm gonna get kind of nasty, right? Think about if your back was really bothering you and you came to work anyway. You may not be charming. And if you're unable to communicate, or you're communicating, but the people around you don't seem to understand you, you're gonna feel even more frustrated. And so behaviors really communicate a variety of different things, as I've mentioned here. So, and feel free if you like to enter some things in the chat box. What are some of the behavioral changes that you see or have been seeing in your person?
So Lori, I think also one of the things that as an elder law attorney that people have said to me is that at the beginning, they feel like their loved one isn't trying hard enough. And if they would just concentrate better, if they would just try a little bit, that things would be so much better. And I hope that maybe you could speak a little bit to that. And the other thing that I'm hearing quite a bit now with the fact that people can't visit or haven't been able to visit as regularly is that maybe their loved one doesn't recognize them through the window, and or maybe recognize them last week, but this week doesn't seem to have any sense of recognition, but then the week after they seem to again. So if you could maybe talk to that. And then lastly, we do have a comment in the chat box about the loss of the personal filter. You know, when people just sort of say whatever out loud of the things that typically we would maybe filter better before we would say those. So I don't know if that might have overwhelmed you, but those are some thoughts I had.
Yeah, I'll try to remember, because those all three of those concepts are really important to recognize. So the first one is really talking about how, I think this is really interesting. The person with dementia often lacks awareness into their own illness, right? So the frontal lobe, the front part of your brain, is affected by dementia. So your ability to have good insight and judgment is greatly impacted. So when the person says there's nothing wrong with me, I'm just fine, it's not that they're in denial. They really just don't often have awareness. In fact, I think the statistic is about 85% of people with mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's or other dementia don't have awareness into their illness. And so while you're saying, try harder, they might not be able to make those connections and do so. So I think it's this fine balance of structuring time, being directive to get people engaged in activities without doing a tug of war. The other concept that you talked about was really these window visits. And I myself, self-disclosure here, have experienced that myself. My mother-in-law has early memory loss, and she moved into assisted living right before COVID hit. And so to be honest, and I haven't even seen her room yet. We haven't been allowed in the facility. Fortunately, she's in the earlier stages, so we have been able to do window visits and check on her. But for those who are in the more advanced stages, either moderate or advanced, who can't make sense of a screen or a window visit, can't pay attention to it, it's not valuable, that can be incredibly difficult. And my only advice is to be very directive in your demands to the facility. So really, whatever you need in order to feel like you're getting information, I think you just talk with the residence director and just be really direct and gracious about it. Like, I need your staff to hold up a phone for my mom, or get her set up on FaceTime so I can see her. Or I'm gonna be calling every day at 5:30 to check in and see how she's doing. But you certainly feel powerless, right? Because you don't really know what's going on behind closed doors. And there have been many advocates, including my colleague Dana Kennedy with AARP, who has been really working towards legislation to require facilities to be able to share, for example, how many COVID cases there might be happening there, and to make sure that residents are being well cared for, have the right PPE, and also have the right communication with staff. But to be honest, I've had more than I like to admit, more people admit that even when they're caring for their person at home, but especially when they're in a facility, that with the change in structure, the lack of activity, lack of communal dining, that their person is really declining, right? Because they're not getting the things they need. And so that can be really frustrating and overwhelming. So I would say a few things, and then I actually am going to be doing a program on managing dementia during COVID, and I'll send the information to Emily and she can get it out to you if you're interested. But things like sending letters, care packages, or at least, as I said, scheduling time to talk with your person during the day can at least make you feel like you have a little bit more control. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. Was there another concept that you mentioned, Emily, that
somebody in
touched upon?
One of our participants wondered if you might have some suggestions. You know, there's that loss of filter where the person just sort of blurts out whatever they want to say, like your hair looks terrible today, or whatever it might be. They just say it out loud. And so, and we have a couple of other comments, so I'll let you attack that one and then I'll give you some more.
Yeah, so let's start with that one and then move forward, and we'll make sure we get your questions answered. But so that's that frontal lobe. So that's exactly how I describe it. Your frontal lobe is your filter. So if you looked at my, kind of busy flower top today and you thought, wow, that's a bit much, you just kind of keep your mouth closed. But if you have dementia, you don't have a filter. So you might say something racist. You might say that person's fat. You might swear at someone. You might say something that you might have never said in the past. I've had family members who said, my mom raised us Catholic and now she is swearing like a sailor. So I think what you do is, again, this really reminds you that not to react, so you can only control one side of communication, not to reinforce it, but I think it's okay to say, hey, that wasn't really comfortable for me. Let's talk about something else. Or ignore it altogether and just remind yourself that this is part of the disease. This is not your person. So this is a perfect segue to when you have these behaviors like saying rude things or wearing the same shirt 50 times or, hoarding things in your person's pocket, you really have to take a step back and think to yourself, like, is this behavior really a problem and whose problem is it? Like, is it more my problem that they're wearing the same shirt 3 days in a row? Does that really matter? Because we kind of get caught up in society and what we expect, and we have to take a step back and as we say in lots of relationships, pick our battles. So what we want to do is kind of look for the trigger. We know that behaviors have a cause, and so we want to ask ourselves, why did this happen? What's changed? What might he or she be telling me? And then our goal is to really try to eliminate the trigger or help our person navigate more effectively. So a caregiver yesterday was telling me that because her person has not been able to go adult day programming, it's been paused for safety due to COVID. She is really overwhelmed because she's not getting breaks, but also, activity structure has really been hard for her. She's trying to balance working and she's trying to balance caring for her mom. And late in the day, her mom is really restless and the behavioral disturbance is starting to really escalate. She starts sometimes swearing or slamming doors or rummaging around the house. And so we talked about how this may very well be because she's got a lot of pent-up energy, and you don't have to be an activity therapist, but is there something that we can do early in the day to help kind of dispel some of that energy so that maybe the afternoons will go a little bit better? Other things that we want to look at, and I'm trying to kind of distill down on some of these triggers. So let's talk about some that might happen in the environment. So misperception is one. And we see that a lot with television. We had an adult child caregiver last night who was telling me about her dad who's taking care of her mom. And when her mom refused to go out to activities pre-COVID, her dad just kind of like let her be. And she was sitting in front of the television for hours and hours during the day. And the daughter felt like that really wasn't good stimulation for her. She was starting to have a lot of restlessness late in the day. So she actually came up with some creative ideas on some word finds that her mom could do and some simple puzzles to kind of keep her mom more engaged, so it wasn't just about television, because television can really be misperceived, particularly in the middle advanced stages of the disease. Other triggers to change are a change in routine, structure, and caregivers. So a lot of us are experiencing this as our person is in assisted living but not having normal routines, or home with us and not having respite caregivers or structure or adult day. So that can really trigger behavioral changes, as well as hands-on care, right? We talked about how as the cognition declines and memory, also that person's ability to manage activities of daily living changes. And so what happens there is that you're in a position where you're having to provide hands-on care, and that can really be uncomfortable for the person, as they're not used to that, right? Everyone has a sense of privacy, or maybe they're having a reaction to you as a family member providing hands-on care. And then lastly, and I'll pause for you in a moment, Emily, the environment. So it's this fine balance, right? And this is so tricky, of having enough activity structure and not too much. So not too much going on in the room. So lots of, too much news, too much noise, too much activity can overwhelm somebody. And then the opposite too, right? Think about if you were sitting in the same chair and not doing much for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours, how that would play into your behavior. So it's this fine balance.
So talking about routine, one of the questions is, again, with this COVID and not being able to visit with folks, and just like your family member, especially when somebody went in just pre-COVID, and so you didn't have that opportunity to kind of get them settled in and see their room and understand what was going on with them, and, just helping with that transition. One of the questions is, do you have any opinion about maybe taking a loved one out of a memory care center just for a short time, because maybe caregiving might be too hard for the loved one, of course, on a long-term basis, and then putting them back in the facility? Do you have some opinion as to good, bad things to look out for?
That is such a great question. That's such a great question. In fact, my brothers-in-law had this question as well. Actually, my in-laws moved in together. My father-in-law was on hospice. And so we knew he was towards the end of his life. He had cancer. And so they moved into assisted living. My husband and brothers-in-law moved them in while I was out of town, while we were still traveling early in March. And so that's why I never got to see her room. But then consequently, at the end of March, my father-in-law passed. And so my brother-in-laws were like, well, what are we supposed to do here? We can't even comfort mom. Like, should we pull her out? So we had lots of these family discussions about what should we do? And so it's really individualized, so I can't tell you what to do, but I will tell you about what they decided to do. So one thing we said back then was, well, if we pulled her out, the facility was saying she couldn't come back in until the pandemic was over. And so at that point, and we know now, we didn't know how long that was going to last. And so unless someone is prepared to care for that person for 6 months to a year, you definitely want to factor that into your decision. So some people make the decision that they can do that and they can manage it. And each facility seems to be a little bit different in what they're permitting and allowing. Especially now, some of the restrictions in assisted living are loosening. So I think you want to find out exactly what your options are before you make a decision like that. And if you do, you just be prepared to be kind of that only caregiver, which can be very intense for both of you for an extended period of time. So I think that's the long answer probably to your question, and not really giving you a clear one, but these are really hard decisions that people are making during this time, right? Whether we had sandwich caregivers last night. Am I sending my kid back to school? Am I keeping my mom at home? Am I, placing her in assisted living? These are really hard questions. So I think you try to get as much information you can so you're making an educated and wise decision and not one out of panic. And then you move on. So the brothers decided to keep my mother-in-law where she was. We were very fortunate. She has a lot of stored resilience. She's a very positive person, and she seemed to be managing okay. We decided that if she didn't appear to be grieving okay, or what we thought was okay, that we might reconsider. But we've been very lucky that she seems to be doing very well there.
So one other question, another person has asked if you have any ideas for coping with when the loved one accuses the staff at the assisted living center of stealing things and rearranging her drawers and moving her toiletry items and using her things. What can you say to your loved one that might be calming without saying, you know, the typical, well, that's not happening and you should be nice to the caregivers, or the things that I think maybe without a filter we would be more likely to say? Any suggestions for that kind of statement?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So two things I would say about that. One is, if you're concerned that things are disappearing, I mean, we don't know, we're not there, right? We don't have access to that person's room. We can't walk through and take an inventory. If you're concerned, I would call the staff and just politely say, you know, sometimes my mom gets things mixed up, but she's very insistent that these things are missing. Would you mind, you know, walking through her apartment on FaceTime and just making sure, and if there are things she doesn't have, I'll be happy to replace them, so that you're not doing it in an accusatory way. If you're not, and you really feel like probably this is her, you know, I mean, she's got to be feeling a lack of control, right? Being confined in her room and feeling stressed and not seeing you, that this is manifesting as more of suspiciousness, and you're not concerned about these items, then I would just say, you know, your job is always to be on the same side as your person. So I literally, when I meet with families in person, I literally talk about this as being opposing, you know, on opposite sides of the desk, like Emily might be, right, as an attorney. But you're the caregiver, and your job is to align with that person, right? You're on their side. So you literally want to be on their side physically and emotionally. So you play upon the emotion. You might say, wow, that really is terrible. That really upset me too. So you're validating their feelings. And then you might say, you know, I'm really sorry about that. I'm going to follow up with the staff. Are there certain items that you need that I could drop off right now? So your job is to try to reassure them. And if there is a way to problem solve, you want to do it. In some cases, there's nothing you can do except for reassure. You know, I'm really sorry that's happening. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so it's hard for me to get in and see you. But I'm going to do my best to follow up with the staff and try to resolve these problems as best I can. And I'm really sorry you're having to go through this. I really miss you. So I'm going to jump into some of the common physical triggers that you might see. So confusion, obviously, is one. Pain and illness. So again, I have a back pain, but I can't tell you in a conventional way. And so again, it's really hard. Caregivers have to be really astute to notice if their person seems to be maybe cringing as they get up out of their chair, or first thing in the morning, maybe they're stiff and you see a grimace. But also if you see an abrupt change in behavior, mentation, thinking, anything, that is an important opportunity to check in with the primary care provider. And if that's not within your control, then that's within the facility. And better safe than sorry to say, hey, you know, I've noticed talking on the phone with her that all of a sudden she seems a lot more confused. And I would like someone to evaluate whether there's a urinary tract infection, or should she be tested for the virus if you're noticing other symptoms? Does she have pneumonia, constipation? We're coming up upon flu season, because those medical things can turn into delirium. So even the person is confused kind of at a baseline. If we have delirium, these symptoms on top of it, they can look exponentially more confused and more distraught. Other things are real basic needs like fatigue, hunger, or thirst. So a caregiver last night was talking about how even though the caregivers have been doing a good job of offering her dad fluids, he doesn't always drink, and he got dehydrated and ended up in the hospital. Toileting needs, if the person is shifting around or grabbing at their belt, or just a general discomfort, dissatisfaction, or distress. So this just gives you kind of a picture of some of the behavioral changes that you might see in the early, moderate, and late. And again, you know the old adage, if you've seen one person with Alzheimer's, or fill in the type of dementia, you've just seen one person. Each person is very unique in their presentation. So what can you do to head things off? So, you know, we always talk about the opportunity to kind of prevent behavioral changes is really our best opportunity when we have the option to do so. So offering rest periods, not having the person sleep all day, but offering some rest periods during the day can be helpful. Reducing unnecessary noise and distraction. So if you're taking care of maybe your parent, for example, and you're also taking care of your kids, making sure that their TV and noise is separated from your parent when they seem overwhelmed or agitated as best you can. These are difficult circumstances for sure. Trying to have a predictable daily routine as best you can. Trying to offer some meaningful activities. So the best way to go about this, I think, is to think about what they used to like to do and try to shape it. So if your mom or dad, for example, used to love to read books but can't concentrate on a whole book, they might enjoy a magazine or a Reader's Digest or a short story. If that's too much, I've had some success with caregivers playing an audiobook, like a short story, for example, or even reading out loud just an article as an opportunity to keep that person engaged. So what we have to do with that question that came earlier of feeling very frustrated with our person is we have to shed our previous expectations, right? So a very wise caregiver said to me once, when I hit a roadblock, hit a wall with my husband, with my job, with my mom and dad, one had Alzheimer's, one had Parkinson's, I have to realign or readjust my expectations, right? If I have expectations that are too high, I'm setting that person up to fail, and I'm setting myself up to be frustrated, angry, and overwhelmed. So I think really what we're talking about here is trying to really address the cause if we know what it is. Is it medical? Is it environmental? Does it have to do with daily structure? Try to keep our own nonverbals calm. So when we're angry, we're frustrated, we raise our voice, what happens? That person often mirrors our emotion. And so these are treacherous times. So I've had caregivers tell me that sometimes they go into the bathroom for 15 minutes to get some quiet time when their person is following them around constantly. I had one caregiver who said when her husband would really escalate late in the afternoon, we worked out a plan for if she was feeling unsafe or feeling like he was really angry, she would sometimes just say, I'm going to run an errand. And she will step into the garage. She'll open the garage door, turn the car on, and just have some air conditioning, soft music, and deep breathing for 10 minutes. Because she unfortunately doesn't have respite, so she doesn't have a way to take off, but that was a way for her to implement some time for her to reset. Try to address that person's emotion. So that's what you're trying to do in that example that someone asked about when someone thinks people around them are stealing. You're trying to address that emotion. Wow, that must be horrifying. Gosh, I would really be pissed off if I felt like people were taking my stuff. And then sometimes your only and best tool is to reassure that person, you know, that's awful. You're right. I know you want to get out of there, but we're in the middle of a pandemic and it's just not safe for you to be at home or elsewhere right now. Lower lights, reduce noise, remove triggers if you can figure out what those are. And then we have a saying at Banner Alzheimer's Institute that you're never going to win an argument with somebody with Alzheimer's disease or other dementia. So arguing is not a good approach. So sometimes that means you have to step outside, step away, count to 10, take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and agree with the person, maybe apologize, distract, or defer. So a great example of that is a dyad I worked with a few years ago in Sun City at our clinic there. And we had a gentleman who had been taking care of his partner for many years. He was an engineer, so he was a little rigid in his thinking. And he and his partner had been in Arizona for 20 some years. And they came from Iowa. And his partner, John, said to him frequently, you know, I really want to go back to Iowa. And so his response was, that is really the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The people we know in Iowa either don't live there anymore or are dead. We have a much better life here. And, you know, I don't even know why you would propose something like that. And as you might guess, it didn't go over well. And so often John would get up, leave the room, and slam the door behind him. And so we talked about, well, okay, maybe we could try a little bit of a different approach here. So what would be the harm in saying, you know, you're right. We had some really amazing times in Iowa. Do you remember when we used to walk our dog around that little pond in the park? Those were really beautiful times. You know, you're right. I think it would be good to take a trip back to Iowa, but you know, it's the middle of winter there, and it'll probably take me some time to get some plans arranged. And so, but I'll definitely get on that. In the meantime, we talked about watching that movie. It's on in about 10 minutes. So why don't we make some popcorn and head into the den and catch that flick.
So Lori, if I can.
So don't beat yourself.
So one of the questions kind of going off of that is, how do you balance honoring your loved one's dignity when you know that you have to do things like secure maybe some of the guns that might be in the house? You might need to take over the mail or start paying the bills. And you want to be respectful, and you want to obviously not upset the person and increase anxiety for that person, but you also need to keep them safe and make sure that they're obviously that their money's okay and that their bills are being paid.
You got it. So these situations are very common because, as I mentioned, the person with memory loss often doesn't believe that they need any help, supervision, right? So I've been paying my bills by myself since I was, 18. I don't really know why you feel like you need to get in my business. I'm doing just fine. I've never had a problem. I've never missed a payment. I've never even been late, right? So what do you do with that? So what happens here, and you asked the question at the right time, because one of the things that we do inadvertently is that we're trying to be good humans. We're trying to tell the whole truth all the time because that's the right thing to do. And it is the right thing to do, but it doesn't work here, unfortunately. So we want to avoid correcting the person. We want to avoid saying, actually, you missed the last 3 mortgage payments. So it is time for me to take over. Or you say you're doing the grocery shopping, but you haven't done that in a long time, because that's really not helpful. And as you're saying, that really mitigates somebody's dignity, right? If they really believe that they're still doing things and we're saying they're not, we just get into an argument. And not only that, we risk fracturing that relationship. So we want to avoid reasoning. We want to avoid arguing. We want to avoid reorienting the person. If they think it's a different time, doesn't really matter, right? We want to avoid always telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And I'll just pick on women. We are the worst at this. We have to feel like we have to over-explain everything. Not useful here, right? Simple, short, to the point is best. We want to avoid exposing our own frustration or anger. So if we're starting to react when the person says something like that, we want to take a step back. We want to avoid unrealistic expectations or demands. So we want to, if the person says, I promise to pay the mortgage on time next month if you just get out of my business, we don't want to set that unrealistic expectation, because that's not going to happen. We're just setting the person up to fail. We want to avoid finger pointing or scolding them. You say you're doing this, but you're not. And we want to avoid trying to retrain them because they can't learn new information. So one way to go about it is to partner. If something were to ever happen to you, it would be good to know where the bills are. So, if you don't mind, I'd love to sit in with you while we start doing bills together. If it's something like care, this caregiver last night gave a great example. Pre-COVID, she had hired a few caregivers, and she spent a lot of time actually getting to know these 2 caregivers before she hired them. And when she introduced them to her mom, she introduced them as her friends. And she just said, hey, hey mom, these are my friends, Juanita and Jackie, and they actually live close by, and they've heard a lot about you, and they're going to be checking on you regularly just to see how you're doing. And she said her mom bought that, and it went really well. Another approach might be, if you're the full-time caregiver and you're getting some respite, to describe that person as an assistant. So not that I hired a caregiver to take care and supervise you, Emily, but I am feeling really overwhelmed. And so I hired an assistant. I'm going to leave that person a list of a few things to do. Don't worry, they're not going to bother you. But I need them to help me out with a few things while I'm out. So I think, you know, folks who have a hard time kind of altering the very truth may have a difficult time with this, and it tends to be very controversial, but it's really not, because your goal here is to always, as you're saying, maintain that person's respect, their dignity, while you're implementing care that they need. So these are some of the de-escalation techniques that we've kind of covered, things like providing rest periods, alternating rest with activities, and activities can be really simple. You don't have to be an activity therapist to ask your person to help you with their capacity. So maybe you're making dinner, and maybe that person can actually slice things for a salad for you. Maybe their dexterity is poor, and they're going to set the table for you. And this is where you have to let your prior expectations go, because so if the napkin lands, you know, on the left side or the right side, and it doesn't quite meet the Molly Manners standards, doesn't matter, right? We just let go of it. It's not going to be done exactly the way you did it, and it might take a lot longer. But if that person's engaged, that's an activity. So modify past activities and shorten the duration. Focus on the process, the pleasure, and success. And I can't say enough about exercise for the person with dementia at their level, just because at the end of the day, when that person is sundowning or agitated, what is that? A lot of it is pent up energy, right? So if there's a way to introduce movement, stretching, short walks early in the day, it's good for them. And frankly, it's probably going to be good for your stress level too. Using that agree, apologize, distract principle. Try to modify our reactions, so try not to be reactive as best we can, and we're all human. Try to learn more about the disease, like you're doing here. I often have caregivers say to me, I'm not sure how I got into this role. I've never had an ounce of patience. So working on that and cutting yourself some slack and trying as best we can to accept our person in the moment. So what does the research show? So one of my colleagues, one of our DNPs, nurse practitioners, Michelle Gregatis Reyes at Banner Alzheimer's Institute, really incredible lady and clinician, did a full lit review on all the research about studied interventions for dementia, non-pharmacological, so non-medication. And so massage and therapeutic touch was one that really had some positive outcomes. So it doesn't mean you have to get your person on a massage table, but it could be done just through hands or shoulders. And I think it's always good to ask the person's permission, even if you're close to them, just to make sure they're comfortable with it. Playing their preferred music. So I can't say enough, there's been probably more research about music intervention in dementia than any other. And the research is very strong that the part of the brain that holds on to music, holds on to it a lot longer, almost remains protected during dementia. So whether that's live music, in these times that's difficult, but there are lots of concerts you can watch on television or on your computer. The beauty of dementia is that if the person really seemed to enjoy it, play it again a couple days later. Speakers or headphones can be helpful for some people, or just their preferred music, and you probably know what that is. The use of aromatherapy, there's been a lot of study on lavender oil, so that could be in a diffuser in the room in the afternoon when you want everyone to calm down. It could be administered through essential oils, a couple drops on someone's pillow or the recliner that they sit on. There's also been research around lemon balm and melissa leaf oil, which I hadn't heard of until I read the study. And then there's been some research actually for quite a long time on sounds of nature, that can be incredibly soothing to somebody who is really uptight later in the day as a result of agitation. So birds chirping, ocean waves, white noise. And again, with the advancement of technology, you don't have to buy things. Those things are typically easily found on YouTube. For example, any pleasant activity, so anything that is pleasurable for that person. Interacting with pets, if that's an opportunity. Simple social interactions, so it could be a photo album, and these days that could be done on a tablet. It could be just showing pictures of the grandkids, or if the person is itching to get somewhere, it could be photos of travel. Some people seem to enjoy photos of children, maybe it's theirs or others, or even pets. And then favorite foods can go a long way. So Emily, if you're in charge of my care, chocolate, maybe a little red wine will be helpful for me. And then that physical activity that we talked about. So are there any questions before I talk a little bit about medical provider intervention?
Yeah, so I have one other question. It was, do you think that a change in environment or the setting can actually be disruptive to the person's physical health?
Absolutely. So two things about that. One is it can be disruptive to the person emotionally when they're in a new environment, but also physically. So I'll give you a great example. So before I joined Banner, I had a private practice, and I used to consult with lots of families. And this particular family, their parent, these were two sisters, their mom lived in independent living, and she had dementia. And the daughters accepted that she had dementia, but they were having a really hard time accepting, I think, the advancement of it. They really felt like she was in early stage, and really she was in moderate stage, and really needed to move to assisted living. So one of the daughters, this is a few years back, had bought a condominium in California, and she's saying, my mom's probably not going to be able to travel much longer. This will be the perfect opportunity for a girls' trip. So they took their mom on this girls' trip, and it was a disaster. So in her apartment, in mom's apartment, the bathroom, when she got out of bed in the middle of the night, if she had to urinate, was always on the right. Well, in the condo, the closet was on the right. And so she often was peeing in the closet in the middle of the night. She was just disoriented. So yes, that created problems. Secondly, when furniture and other things are moved around and the person isn't aware of it, they can start tripping on those things. So those two things were a challenge. And then when they went to take her to the beach, you may be aware that along with memory, dementia can affect someone's visual spatial skills. And so in the old days of memory care, if you've ever toured one, or they may still have them, you might notice that they used to create a mural over an exit door. And so the person with dementia would just see whatever was painted, like a bookcase or a beach scene where we could easily see the handle, right? So the visual spatial skills are different. And so they took their mom to the beach, and her visual spatial skills were different. She wouldn't even step on the sand. It was very disturbing to her. And once they coaxed her to take one step, it just felt really funny to her. She wouldn't go to the beach at all. So the long answer to your short question is yes. I think the new environment, sometimes it's unavoidable, can create challenges for the person, both physically, they might trip over things or not know where things are. So I think what you want to do as best you can, depending on where your person is in the disease state, is you can make things more dementia friendly, an environment. So you could, for example, have a picture, and if you go to Banner Alzheimer's Institute, we did this a couple of years ago. We changed the signage on the bathroom that said women and men, and now it's a picture of a toilet. Not exciting, but for somebody with dementia, there's going to be greater recognition that that is a place where I might have to go to the bathroom, right? So you could do some cues like that. Also, just look around the environment. And actually, if you Google search it, the Alzheimer's Association has a great tool on environment, or you could probably call their helpline. And it just makes you think about things you might not have, like should you pull that rug out of the way? And then step into the room. So light, you know, one of those lights kind of like I have in my office that has an arm and a bright light. If it's standing on the floor, it could be misperceived as a person. So you're in bed and you have visual spatial changes. It's the middle of the night. You wake up, there's a light on. It looks like a person. The person can be very upset. So I think try to look through the lens as best you can at the environment and make adjustments, or look for triggers. So if the person comes running out of the room, there's a man in my room, come in and look to see what might appear to be something that's distressing. So that's a great question.
So I know we only have about 10 minutes left, but I just want to make sure one of the great questions that we got was you used the word sundowner, and I explained it back on the chat box that it's when somebody becomes more confused or agitated in the afternoons. But if I have, as a lawyer, if I have not stated clinically what that means, it would be helpful if you could just reiterate when you talk about what sun.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So sundowning, I always say it's a pop psych term because it's not really a clinical term per se, but it is a term that describes that as the day goes on, as the sun goes down, the person may very often become more agitated, if they have delusions, if they see things that aren't there, those things are, if they're angry or belligerent, likely as the day goes on, that's going to happen more often. Why? There's been a lot of research around it, and one thing I would say is to give you something to think about. One of my clients in my private practice before I joined Banner had mild cognitive impairment. I used to see her for counseling. She had a lot of depression. Then she had early Alzheimer's and then moderate, and I worked with her and her husband, and she taught me a lot about the disease. And she said things like, you know, Lori, when you go for coffee with your friends and family, when you're just having coffee, like that's a really easy thing for you. For me, I am working double or triple as hard to look normal, to understand what's said, to be able to respond appropriately, to not listen to all the other conversations that are going on at the coffee shop. And so by after coffee, I need a nap. I'm exhausted. So I think exhaustion and fatigue is often why the person with dementia is having these sundowning syndrome issues, which is why one of the ounces of prevention we talk about is implementing rest periods. So even late in the day when that person is upset, that's a good time to turn the lights down, eliminate television, play some music, or have quiet time. Do a quiet activity, or let the person rest. Make sure they're not sleeping for 2 or 3 hours, because then we know that nighttime sleep could be impacted. But give them the opportunity to rest. Maybe it's just in a recliner with a magazine. Give them the opportunity to take a half an hour, no more than an hour, to rest when they seem agitated. So that's a great question about sundowning. So I hope I answered that. So when do you contact the medical provider? So again, my lens, I'm not a pharmacologist. My lens is always that we want to try, because aging adults of all kinds, particularly ones with dementia, are incredibly sensitive to medications that we might add. So we always want to try to modify the environment, look at the physical daily activity and structure, look at triggers as the first steps. Because most of the time, I think we can really eliminate or minimize some of those behavioral changes that happen. You know, there are times where we're doing everything right and it's just not working. And so that's really an important opportunity for us to notice, be aware, and involve our medical provider. So it might be that you're kind of keeping a log of the behaviors, what time of day they occur, or a few behaviors so that you can articulate or send in a patient portal information to your medical provider. If you see that abrupt change in behavior, mental status, or function, remember we talked about that could be related to a new medication, it could be a urinary tract infection, it could be something medical that is triggering what we call delirium. So that's always really important to let the medical provider know, because we want to treat whatever the cause is to bring that person back to their baseline. If you suspect pain or infection, talk to the medical provider. I mean, you're probably a really good observer, so don't discount your observations. If you suspect depression, so Maybe your person's tearful. Maybe they're really irritable or cranky a lot. Or maybe they just don't quite seem like themselves, especially now when they're more isolated and cooped up. Talk to the medical provider if you suspect there's depression. They might be able to use a screening tool or talk with you more about symptoms, because depression is very treatable. And so that's what we're doing here. So unfortunately, we don't have a way to medically treat dementia, cure it, recede it, bring the person back to where they were, unfortunately. But what we're doing is treating symptoms. So we can slow down progression with several medications. We can treat depression or anxiety with an antidepressant. And often our providers are using an antidepressant because they have kind of a lower side effect profile and could be safer than an anti-anxiety agent, for example. We might be treating sleep. Often our physicians will recommend an antidepressant that might have kind of a calming quality that could be given in the evening, or maybe even melatonin. And then if there's something that's really serious going on, like a hallucination, so the person's hearing or seeing things that aren't there and they're disturbing, they're having delusions. So they're saying, you know, someone stole my stuff, and you're redirecting them, you're soothing them, like those techniques we talked about, but they're getting really anxious. Maybe they're barricading their room, or maybe they're sounding like the interventions you're using just aren't working and they seem to be in distress. I would definitely talk with the medical provider. And then if there's violence, so this happens. People think violence is common in dementia. It's not, but it does happen sometimes in Alzheimer's, more commonly in a frontotemporal dementia, and your safety and that person's safety is paramount. So you definitely want to talk to your medical provider about that. And then if you just are like throwing up your hands and everything you've tried has not worked, you definitely want to make an appointment with the medical provider. And, you know, I don't know how other places are doing, but I imagine it's similar. So our institutes are doing some in-person visits, and we've taken a lot of safety precautions and hygiene precautions, if that's the best way for your person to be seen. We're doing phone consultations if we can't figure out another way, if you don't have a smartphone or device. Or we're actually seeing a lot of people and their caregivers through telehealth. So if that's an option for you, you know, figure out what your provider has available so that you can get your needs met, or your person's needs met, if everything you're trying just isn't working. So I think I want to stop there and just make sure that we don't have any other questions.
So the one more question I have is whether there's, and I think you had talked earlier about when you've seen one person with dementia, you've seen one person with dementia. But the question is about, you know, is there any kind of a flow chart or an outline as to causes for functional declines, or things people maybe should be looking out for? Because I've heard from a lot of our clients, when I look back, this person probably has had this for the last 5 years. And so I think part of it is, you know, are there things that maybe could be done earlier that we should be looking for?
So yes, I mean, it sounds almost like a twofold question. So one, each person's individual, but you can definitely read about or attend additional classes that we offer, or the Alzheimer's Association offers, to get a better understanding of the progression of the disease. So you kind of know what might come next, knowing that your person is very unique. And then the second part of the question was really about, it was about learning the phases of the disease, and then remind me what the second part was as I advance my slides here.
Yeah, so just some kind of an outline about what functional declines there are, I guess. I don't know whether it's always the same. Somebody loses this part of cognition and therefore they have a functional decline that perhaps is, that we can look for.
You know, that's a good question. So I think if you learn more about the phases, you'll learn that. So like in the early stage, for example, the person is really having more trouble with memory and organizing steps. But in the middle phase is often where we see kind of this disconnect, more disconnect from the mind and body. So you might be seeing more of those functional changes. So you might start out where the person's getting dressed just fine on their own. And as the disease progresses, now you're having to lay out clothes, and you might have to lay them out in the right order. And then as the disease progresses in the middle phase, you may be noticing incontinence of urine, for example. You might be noticing that your person doesn't know exactly where the t-shirt goes, so you might be having to help them get that on. So I think it's really kind of a progressive thing. But I kind of heard you asking about symptoms. So, you know, it may be too that it's helpful for you to talk with your medical provider about the type of dementia, because I know that there's this idea that we don't really need to know because there's nothing we can do anyway. But I think that that's not necessarily the case. I think it is really helpful to know what type of dementia, and having those pearls that you were talking about earlier, like when I look back, this is when I first noticed it. These are the changes I first noticed. These are the changes I'm noticing now. To get a clear diagnosis, I think can really be helpful. It can help you better understand the kind of disease, what to look for, what you might be able to anticipate. And it also helps the medical provider know how to best treat the disease. Because actually dementia experts, dementia specialists, so like a geriatric psychiatrist or a neurologist who specializes in memory disorders, might use a slightly different approach to medication intervention depending on the type of dementia. So that's kind of just an adjunct to what you're asking. And then to just make you aware, you know, I think that it's always good to start with your medical provider. The primary care doctors can often do an excellent job of diagnosing and treating the disease. If you feel like your medical provider doesn't quite understand or doesn't have that expertise, or you're having a lot of behavioral changes, that may be a great opportunity to see a specialist, kind of like you would do if you had a rash on your face. You'd start with your primary care. If it wasn't getting better, you didn't feel understood, you might look to a specialist.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you. You know, obviously at our law firm, we see lots of families who are struggling with this, and you know, some of them have their estate planning in order, and so at least we have a roadmap, and others don't, and so that might be a more complicated journey that they need to take. And so I so appreciate the work that Banner Alzheimer's does in the community with their families. And thank you so much for your time in coming to speak to us today, and for all of the participants for listening. It will be recorded. So if any of you have friends or family or loved ones who were unable to attend, we'll have that as well, both Lori and I, that we're happy to provide to anybody who wasn't able to attend today. So we wish you all the absolute best. It's more difficult times than you thought you could have, especially when you have somebody with a memory disorder and when they're more distant from you. So we wish you the absolute best in dealing with those situations. And thank you again so much for attending. Appreciate it. Thank you.